I'm the Director of Training for the National Press Club Journalism Institute, the nonprofit affiliate of the National Press Club. My name is Bara Baida. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's program, Online Harassment and Privacy Protections, What Journalists Need to Know. This is such an important topic as we start this election season. So before we get started, please drop us a note in the chat. Tell us where you're from and where you're tuning in from. The chat box is also the place we'll be taking questions today. So make sure you use that instead of the Q&A for any questions during this webinar. We'll be stopping to answer your questions throughout this next hour. We'll also have a live transcription option, which is available to you at any time during this program, and the instructions are in the chat. Also, this program is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to you after this program. It will also appear on our website and in our newsletter. So if you aren't already receiving the Institute's daily newsletter for journalists, it's free and you can subscribe now. The link is in the chat. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our expert instructor today, David Huerta. David is a senior digital security trainer at Freedom of the Press Foundation, where he trains journalists in privacy-enhancing technology to empower a free press. He's taught hundreds of trainings across the world, including the digital security track at the National Association of Hispanic Journalists Conference. David, we're so grateful to have you here sharing your expertise with us, and I'm going to hand the baton over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction. Glad to be here. I hope everybody is having a good start of their day, or I'm noticing a few different time zones, so maybe this is kind of coming in at the end, in which case, an extra thanks for joining us in the middle of the night. I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about a few different topics that mostly center around protecting your own work, protecting your information online, and we're going to go ahead and do a thing where I share my screen and jump into some very introductory slides. A lot of what I'll be covering today is also something that is covered largely by a number of online guides that we have. So I'll get into how to find those later on. All right, so I'm from the Freedom of the Press Foundation. We do a few different things. My team basically does a lot of digital security training sessions similar to these. Our online guides in this case are at freedom.press/training. So many of the topics that we sort of touch on today, we go in depth into a lot of our written content. Speaking of written content, we also have a weekly newsletter, which you can check out here. And of course, we're also known for being the sort of open source project maintainers of a whistleblowing platform called SecureDrop, which is used by a few different newsrooms these days. And of course, the US Press Freedom Tracker, which records attacks on the press since 2017. This is sort of like a newsroom within the org that is sort of the paper of record, so to speak, on attacks on press freedom within the US. Okay, so when it comes to digital security or cybersecurity, online safety, whatever combination of words people use to describe what they're aiming for, we like to kind of like frame that discussion around grounding things into the idea of assessing risk. And everybody has a different idea of what this means. In the cybersecurity industry, we call this threat modeling. We tend to call it something like basically just assessing risk, just to kind of like very directly say like what we're doing. And for us, that boils down into what are our 5 essential questions. What do I have to protect? And in this case, some of these things are like pretty obvious. There are a lot of places online where our information, like our home address, our phone numbers, potentially the same information of our family members is available for sale online. And sometimes this is used as part of an online harassment campaign. For any of you that have heard of doxing, or haven't heard of doxing, it's basically when somebody that is in opposition to whatever it is you're writing will post your private information online in public for all to see as this kind of intimidation tactic, and also as an avenue for people to direct harassment towards your phone or address. This unfortunately does happen fairly frequently to journalists of many different beats. There's kind of the more sort of like salient examples where we would think this would be a thing that happens. For example, April Glasser, who covered online hate, basically ended up having to address a online like hate campaign that was directed at her on a number of different forums. Nowadays, it's also things like Discord chats and things like that. And then of course there's the from who, like who exactly is it that's doing this? And normally speaking, these are not sophisticated threat actors. When we talk about things like secure drop, for example, that's a whole other type of equation where we're thinking about national sort of like mass surveillance, targeted surveillance, like all these other things that are like very, very advanced. Um, the thing is, a lot of these kind of doxing campaigns are very easy, take basically no technical skill, despite the fact that the people, doing them may think otherwise about themselves, and are usually there to just try to like basically make life unpleasant for the person that they're trying to silence. And the resources are fairly small, but extremely dangerous. So in this case, your data is your troll adversary's resource. And things like home addresses, phone numbers, for example, are usually things that come up and stuff like that. And many of the places, and also older social media content, for example, things that you regrettably may have said in the past that you might want to clean up, or other mentions about your personal life that may have been posted in the past that now in retrospect, maybe you want to get rid of. Then, of course, there's likelihood, and this is a tricky question. I would say that there's a lot of things that go into this equation. Probably not a surprise to many people, but a lot of these trolls tend to target women. This is some self-reported data from the Pew Research Center that kind of covers this topic. And of course, other aspects of identity go into this as well. Uh, there's also, I would say, an issue of, a very long-standing sort of like almost like tradition of uh, basically targeted harassment towards women, also towards people in the LGBT community. And this began a long time ago when these kind of campaigns were first sort of like became like a thing during events like Gamergate, for example, but then evolved usually even with the same people towards attacks on people covering online hate, on people covering like politics. But again, it's one of those things that unfortunately when it comes to which beat do you have to be in to worry about online harassment? The reality is, everybody has something that they're going to be upset about. And it's really, really surprising to see what gets people riled up. I had a friend that wrote reviews about mobile games and had an entire online harassment campaign levied against her. Seemingly like boring topic. But again, we're also coming into an election year. Um, and politics, as many of us know, especially electoral politics and especially presidential elections, tend to be pretty hot topic issues. And of course, doxing can get worse. So in addition to that, there's also swatting. So as I mentioned, like doxing can be a way for an avenue of harassment to open up that involves it being directed to your like physical address. And this is one of them. And this is basically when a long time prank basically that evolved into this like more common harassment tactic where somebody pretends to be like essentially kidnapped by you and then calls the police department and says like, help, I'm being held by this person, they're gonna kill me, come rescue me. Afterwards then police show up with guns drawn sometimes. This does happen to journalists. This is an example that is a little bit more famously known, a Miami Herald columnist in this case that had a swatting attack levied against him in 2019. And every police department is different, so they're all going to have like varying degrees of knowledge of like what swatting even is and how to respond to that. So unfortunately, that's like one of those things where it may be worth checking in with your city and seeing if this is on the radar or not. And then, of course, let's go to this final question. It's like, how will we go to protect our assets? And there's, this sort of equation of time, money, and technical skill that goes into play in these kind of like situations and in these kind of like tabletop exercises. Time is something that journalists don't have a lot of. Money, generally not either. But technical skill is something that we can work a little bit on today and that you can keep working on afterwards. Because it turns out our brains come with our bodies for free and we can just start using them whenever we want, which is really great news. All right. So as the old saying goes, haters are going to hate. We have this, we have a job that basically is going to make people think in a way that is maybe a little more critical about whatever worldview they have or had. And in this case, that's going to set people, and we know that. We know, we live in we're here because we think that we are basically wanting to be a part of this ecosystem, a larger ecosystem of free expression and free speech. That's great. But maybe we don't want people to send SWAT teams to our house. Let's talk about how to protect our personal lives from being blurred with our professional lives. All right, so the kind of first most important identifier I would say to protect is actually your phone number. And this is a tough one because largely speaking, if we're talking with sources, we're giving them exactly that. And there's some risks though that come along with that is that a phone number is largely used as a means of looking people up in different social media sites and platforms, and a lot of other places too, which we'll talk about. And of course, that is in and of itself a potential avenue for harassment. That being said, though, there are options out there that involve not giving away your personal number for these kind of situations. If possible, your user may be able to provision you with a secondary phone with a secondary number. There are some like state laws in California, for example, that would basically almost, I think, require that if you're using your phone as a decent part of your job. That may be worth looking into. There's also, for example, SIMs and eSIMs, the ability to have multiple phone numbers in one phone so that you can have like different avenues for each one. And then, of course, the kind of cheapest route is Google Voice. So for any of you that have never used Google Voice before, this is kind of a useful tool because in the US it's free, but in this case, one of the caveats is you have to sort of like continue. Let's not have people's as actual numbers and things here. Sorry. In the US, Google Voice numbers are free. In this case, though, to keep them, you have to actually use them with relatively frequency. Otherwise, that number goes back into the pool of available numbers that people can sign up for. This is great because then you can give random strangers on the internet this other number. And then if it does become an avenue of harassment, you can get rid of it and get another one. And when it comes to sort of like being able to protect all these online accounts that we have, just to begin with, we all have various amounts of social media now. We're sort of this weird like post Cambrian explosion of things that people are signing up for. And there's a risk that like, what if somebody hacks my Instagram? What if somebody hacks my whatever other account? There's a lot of like really easy things you can do to protect yourself from these kind of situations. Thankfully, a lot of this boils down to enabling what's called two-factor authentication and enabling some privacy settings. And I don't have the resource pack here listed, but I can see if I can share that to you afterwards. As far as, understanding what sites even have two-factor authentication available, there's a website called 2fa.directory, which I recommend checking out because from there you can basically look at whether the site that you use actually has a form of two-factor authentication or not. And some of them might vary. For example, we see, SMS, which means text messages. We see things like hardware and software, which are a little bit different. And in this case, means something like if any of you use apps like Google Authenticator, it's basically stuff like that. So Google Authenticator in this case is a kind of app that will and there's several authenticators like this. Your newsroom, for example, may use Duo, may use Authy. Okta, any of these other apps. But what these do is you can set them up with your online account so that instead of having a code texted to you, which requires relying on the security of that phone number and of the phone company, you can have a separate app that basically doesn't transmit the code, but just generates it every 30 seconds that you can type it in. And that way you just basically look at your account on your app, say like, oh, the 6-digit code that I need to enter when logging in is this, and then you're basically in. And then the hardware keys that, are kind of alluded to are made by a few different sort of vendors. One of the more popular ones is Yubico. These are incredibly resilient against account hijacking because of the fact that when you log into something, it's asking for a password. It's asking potentially for a two-factor authentication code. And in this case, this kind of device handles it for you. So it looks like a USB drive, but it's not a USB drive. And what you do is you basically, when prompted to plug it in by your account after it's set up, you basically just tap the little button at the top and then it logs you in. This is great because in this case, you cannot be tricked into handing over a two-factor authentication code, as we've seen in some very advanced phishing attacks. But in this case, the actual like brains of what this does behind the scenes is it actually checks to make sure that it's the correct website that it signed up with originally before releasing that code to log in for you. So pretty cool stuff, highly recommended. I really wish these were more popular because these would literally just solve account hijacking overnight if they became popularized. So when it comes to things we may have said in the past, things that we may want to clean up, many social media sites do have a way to let you look at things happening in the past. And in this case, this outline is sort of not a like specific sort of visualization of anything, but more of a thing you can do using the kind of existing search tools that are on places like X, like on other platforms, like even Mastodon now, for example. So what do you look for when you're looking for past posts? You can look for things like location to see whether you've accidentally mentioned a little bit too much about where you live. Perhaps places that you hang out, perhaps things that relate to your day-to-day routine, which could actually indicate where you might be approximately like close to in terms of where your house is, near-term future plans, and family and social webs, because we do sometimes talk publicly about our family. Perhaps we want to remove them from the visibility of being a potential target for an online harassment campaign, in which case then it may be useful to go back in time, see anything we posted in the past we may have said about our close ones. So, and this is how you do that. Unfortunately, I can't demo this, but there is kind of a screenshot that shows you how this works. And the reason why I can't demo it is I have a protected X account. So this only works with X accounts that are not public. So meaning that they're basically protected so that only your followers can see your posts. But if you have like a normal Twitter account that is not protected, that is not private, you can use Twitter Advanced Search to really kind of like hone into your entire Twitter history to see like, okay, did I say anything embarrassing about this or that? Did I say anything that mentions any of my family members? You can search for all of that here, look to see what comes up, and then see if maybe you want to go ahead and delete those old posts. And unfortunately, there used to be some really great sort of bulk deleting tools that would automatically purge old posts. Nowadays, those stopped working. There's some newer ones that are coming out now, but I haven't had the chance to kick the wheels on them. And this is due to the new sort of like X API, sort of a lot of behind the scenes changes happening over there. Of course, TikTok is becoming a fairly popular social media platform, and there's a lot of sort of things that you can do to protect a variety of different things that tend to be used for online harassment. So things like profile views, for example, post views may indicate that you are basically a juicier target, perhaps, than somebody that isn't like that nobody's looking at or knows about. Um, And there's also ways to basically mitigate things like the following list liked videos, so that those don't become like places where harassment spills over into. There's also something called duetting and stitching, and that is essentially, in this case, a way to sort of like have a video happen in parallel with another video. So if you're like dunking on it, this is more popular with a series of like Gordon Ramsay basically being horrified by TikTok recipes, which are rightfully horrifying. Um, and you can basically turn that off so that doesn't happen to you. And then, of course, just like with other social media sites, you can tag who you mentioned in video descriptions, etc. All right. We also have a guide for that online at freedom.press/training. So this is a checklist from the NYT Open. I'm going to go ahead and open this up actually and share it in chat. But this kind of goes through a few different platforms. It's pretty up to date. Like we have some of the newer ones like Blue Sky, like Mastodon, TikTok, kind of in here. They go into a really, really good sort of introductory view into what to do in these situations. So I'm going to go ahead and just link to that here. And unfortunately, it's just this really long Google Doc link. This is from the NYT Open group for any of you familiar with that. All right. But it's pretty useful in that regard. Before I go on, though, does anybody have any questions about anything we've covered so far that they'd like to share? So we have a great question from Viola that basically asks about how, certain posts made on Facebook in this case could be exposed. And in many cases, it can vary. Everybody has different security settings for Facebook, but in some cases, yeah, if it's something that anybody was able to sort of just like look at, then it's pretty a safe assumption that it was originally set to public at some point. And maybe it was just captured when it was public. Of course, there's different sharing settings in Facebook, so it could be that it was just set to friends and that this person just had a very, very wide social graph of people that maybe included some strangers that were wanting to sort of like have access to their more private sort of posts. Yeah, and as far as checking phone number-based platforms to see if her numbers are on them, every platform is going to be a little bit different. So it really depends. There's ways to basically just turn that off, which is sort of like the easy answer to that is that even if your phone number is like a part of, on Twitter or on Facebook, almost every one of these platforms has sort of a like allow friends to find me by email or phone number feature. And if you look for that and make sure that it's not checked, make sure that people cannot actually find you by email address or phone number, then that basically more or less solves that problem, which is great. Oh yeah, and I'm also interested in seeing what happens with TikTok as we've seen sort of a sort of mixed result coming out of Montana on their particular ban. All right. If there's no other questions, just gonna go ahead and jump back in. So in addition to kind of like the normal use of social media and the stuff you can easily find there, there's also more advanced ways to collect publicly available online information. And there's like a very, very, I think, overly fancy term for what this is called open source intelligence or OSINT, which makes it sound like cool somehow. And this normally just boils down to just really fancy Googling, things like literally Googling your name and city to see what comes up. There's also a lot of interesting open source platforms, however, like Profiler and others that basically are more sophisticated technical people, let's say an opposition research firm working for a political campaign. would be able to use tools like these to be able to automate a lot of the sort of like searching and where to search for things to look for public records of some kind. And then, of course, there's things that are just sort of inherent to the way the internet works. For example, if you've ever bought a domain name for your website or blog, your domain name registrar, the company that you bought the domain name for, may have offered a private registration option, which is very popular now. In the past, it wasn't really much of a thing. And the reason for that is, a lot of the sort of like billing contact info can be made public through that process. And of course, there's government records. So let's circle back to search engines. So if we look for example, your name and your city in a Google search, what would come up? So there is, of course, this guide that I'll link to here that, let's see here, we got that I'm going to share. And this is also part of the NYT Opens guide. But if you look at search engines, you'll notice that search and Bing both have these sort of like operators, as they're called. And what these let you do, and you can kind of see some examples, is you can really sort of like narrow down your search results to specific sites, for example, to sort of like and operators where you have to see like the name in combination, where you might want to have like a wildcard in between their search term. And if you want to remove sites, you can do that as well. This is really handy if you want to see what your online footprint is without the sort of like giant list of stuff that you published under your byline. So the hyphen search here, which removes a site from the search results, is pretty useful in that regard. So you can like really see like what's actually hiding underneath all that. This particular, like the file type search, is actually super useful because almost every sort of, in many cases, when I talk to journalism students, at some point they would have shared a PDF of their resume on a public link that their prospective employer basically asked them to make public. The sort of like side effect of that is that now you have a PDF that potentially has your phone number and your address on it that is publicly searchable online. You can kind of like see if maybe your past self has done this really easily by looking for your email address and then looking at the file type to see if it matches that. So pretty handy search tool, I would say. And then of course there's Whois data. So this is an example that could be used for a few different things. So if we go to, for example, whois.com. There's also just a lot of, it's used to kind of see if a domain name is available most of the time. But in many cases, like, well, we don't have to go through this add written version of this. We can just do the command directly. So let's say who is freedom.press. Let's see who we got for, oh, got my application firewall being like, what's going on? I'm on a hotel Wi-Fi connection. Yeah. So you can see here, it's very tiny text, and I apologize for that. But you have this sort of like redacted for privacy feature that if you buy a domain name, most of them will offer the private domain registration. This is what that does, basically, if you ever wanted to see what that looks like. There are some domain name types that actually don't allow that. The .us domain name, for example, which pressfreedomtracker.us has, does not allow private registration. So if you have a .us name, that's something you have to consider. Luckily, this is like our old postal address in San Francisco, and this is, our like old phone number. Let me just jump back into. Oh, whoopsie. Sorry, I seem to have not stopped sharing my screen. Let me turn that back on. Everybody should be able to see that now. All right. So we have an example of a domain name in this case that doesn't include private domain registration. And we have an old Google Voice number that basically we don't have access to anymore. We have a postal address in this case that, was our old San Francisco postal mail address. But you can imagine how this could have gone terribly wrong. Like this could have been like somebody's actual sort of like home address. This could have been somebody's actual phone number. So that's just something to double check on for any domain names that you own. There's also the question of government records. So, people like to point out, it's like, yes, if you buy a house, like you'll have a record in the county registrar in some places, in some cities. And that's true. Many of us maybe don't own property, but that in this case is still leaves a number of other records to cite for people to kind of like sift through. One of which is owed money. So in the US, for example, we have a sort of like patchwork of state comptrollers, and they do many things, but one of the things they do is if, for example, there is a class action lawsuit and there's a payout to people affected by that, you get a check potentially mailed to you. But in some cases, like it doesn't get mailed automatically. People have to sort of opt in to have it sent to them, and of course, it varies state by state. But if you were to go to, for example, in New York, where I live, you have basically this comptroller site where you can look for money owed to you. The problem with this site, and other states may have the same issue, others don't, is when you search for your name to see if money is owed to you, you'll see everybody matching your name and you'll see their home address to confirm whether or not that's you or not, which, as you can imagine, is a bit of a vulnerability because that means that like a troll can basically look up your name and then potentially find your address through it. Luckily, this is an easy fix. If you do find your actual address on this, you can basically opt in to get that check or whatever sent to you. And as a bonus, you get money. So not a bad deal. Now, as far as like Google search results, we went through kind of a few examples for Google and Bing on how to search for things. If you want things to not show up in Google searches specifically, there's not really a specific website for it. You have to like find a thing you want to remove and then like search for remove PII from Google and then go through this removal request process. And what this does is it'll actually just remove it from Google. Like this is a Google feature that's only for Google search. Like people can still find the same thing potentially on Bing or DuckDuckGo or Yandex. So that's just something to keep in mind, as it doesn't remove it from the internet. It just makes it less easy to find on your search results. And then, of course, saving the worst for last is third-party data brokers. This is kind of like there's social media, there's open source intelligence, and then there's data brokers. And data brokers are probably the scariest example about how personal information gets out there, because, it's like a very, very sort of like directly selling your data type business model, like not a sort of like groups of ad markets or whatever, but just like, no, we are literally like these companies are literally just collecting as much as they can about as many people as they can and creating as big of a dossier as possible to sell to whoever wants to buy it. And this is not, this is a little bit more regulated in other countries. In the US, it's largely not at all. To some degree, there's some state laws that kind of affect this, but many of them self-regulate, which means that there's ways to opt out. There are hundreds of these, though, and this is why we recommend checking out my friend Yael Grauer's Big Ass Data Broker opt-out list. So I'm just going to quick link for this in the chat. This is super useful because you have this giant list that is like pretty well maintained. Yael kind of like makes sure that it's pretty up to date. And it kind of shows you, it has direct links to how to opt out with instructions on how to opt out to each one of these. This is great because if you ever just wanted to like spend a Sunday just trying to opt out to different sort of data broker sites, you can do that all through this in kind of like one website that you start at and finish at. There's a few other options that you can look into. For example, there is Delete Me. And this is a popular tool with a lot of newsrooms. I feel like a lot of newsrooms are actually like offering it to employees that are a little bit more public facing. But they'll basically do all the opting out for you. Like they'll literally just pay somebody to kind of go through that. And their pricing varies depending on how many people you opt into. For example, if your newsroom wanted to buy a set of subscriptions, they can get like a discount based on quantity. But it's roughly a little bit north of 100 a year, I think. There's similar newer options that have come out recently, like Mozilla Monitor, which I only recently started out using, and it actually is pretty good. There's actually a few sites that Mozilla Monitor found that Delete Me sort of like missed. So I was happy to see that Mozilla Monitor was kind of doing a pretty good job to that. So there's an excellent question about any downsides to opting out from these sites en masse. There are a few minor side effects. So yeah, oh yeah. So last time I did this manually in 2015, it took me an entire Sunday. So it does take time to kind of go through the entire process because back in the day, many of them required things like uh, opting out via mailing a physical postal letter. So, it's a mix. Some of them required being on the phone with somebody. It's kind of all over the place. A lot of them now have the ability to let you opt out via an online form, which is very handy. So, yeah, in this case, one of the downsides is like one of the uses or business uses for this kind of tool for data brokers basically, and these people search sites is, for example, if you're applying for an apartment, you'll see that most landlords, prospective landlords, will try to verify your past addresses using sites like these. And if you're just like mysteriously not showing up in anything, they're going to have questions. So that's kind of the one of the side effects of that. Yeah. And so in this case, there's another question about the danger of using these. If you're like basically, because in order to like tell Delete Me or Mozilla Monitor who you are to delete yourself, you have to give them your address, your phone number. And it's like, well, do you trust this company with that info? And that's a really good question. And they all have sort of their online documentation that talks about what they do to protect that info. I would kind of circle back to assessing risk and ask, it's like, well, okay, if my personal information is already sort of out there, if my address and phone number are literally out there for anybody with like $5 in their pocket to access, um, is the danger of removing that for the sake of trusting only one company instead of just the entire internet with that information, a good transaction? And I would say yes. I would say having one company that basically has that info for delisting you, one more company that has, I guess, because your credit card company, all your banks obviously are going to have that, um, is probably definitely a privacy upgrade over just literally anybody on the internet being able to get that. All right, so a question in the chat, some credit card companies require the user to enter a social security number to opt out of their mailings. Um, Yeah, I mean, I would say like there's so much financial reporting and data tracking that these companies do that unfortunately you kind of they probably know a lot of that already. Um, and it's one of those things where it's not great. It's not a great situation to have to tell your, credit card company your social security number to opt out. Um, but there's probably chances are they know that already. Um, so that's kind of the upside and downside of that, I guess. I haven't ran into a data broker company, like a people finder company that has asked for a social security number to opt out. So far I haven't ran into that yet, but that might be out there. Can we charge platforms data brokers for time expenses deleting our data? Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any legal mechanism for that. Like I said, a lot of this industry is like extremely unregulated. It's not something that the different states will have different laws around that, but I've never heard of that being a means of recourse. Yes. So as far as the website for de-indexing for Google, so this is the unfortunately annoying part is I can't link to it. You have to like literally do a Google search for that page to make it come up. I don't know why Google made it this way. Um, but if I were to go to google.com, remove PII from Google, This is basically the support page. So actually, yeah, there is kind of this, but then the actual link is to remove is okay. Yeah, so maybe it is here actually. So yeah, I'm just gonna post the support answer. It used to not be linkable. It used to be a thing that popped up on the side instead of the result, and it was a whole thing. But luckily, this is improved. So great. So now I can share that with you. There you go. All right. So that's kind of the, oops, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of things here. So one of the things you can do if you want to have a little bit of fun slash anxiety is you can actually look for yourself on whitepages.com. It's sort of like one of the examples that we like to use opting out because it's one that requires you to have your phone with you to opt out because it'll robocall you when you opt out to verify that the person who owns this number is the one that is opting out or requesting that opt out. And I noticed some links in the chat if you want to follow along. But the way this works is, as you can see from my screen here, that you have, this is just one data broker out of hundreds, but you can look for, and I've already opted out of this, so I'm pretty cool with this here. None of these are me, but you kind of notice that there is sort of like an example of, the kind of PII that's available, cell phone numbers, addresses, relatives, for example, potentially links to their entry on whitepages.com. And the way opting out works is there is a specific support page that, let me see if I can link to that. There's a specific support page with instructions on how to do that using this opt-out site. So from this place that I linked out to, you can basically go in and access this suppression request site, as they call it, this opt-out site. And then from there, once you have that open, you find a listing you want to remove. So if I were to go back to this other David Huerta and like copy that URL, that domain, basically, you can right click on that, say copy link. And then when you go to the opt-out page, you basically enter it here. You click on next. And then from there, it basically is like, hey, is this you? It shows them your address, and I don't want to do that on like a live recording for this other David Huerta. And then if you're like, yeah, that's me, that's the number, and then it'll be like, all right, we're gonna call that number to verify it's you, and then you can opt out on the robocall. And then whitepages.com robocalls you. It's like, do you confirm the removal of request for data? And you're like, yeah. And then it says it takes like 2 days to remove the entry, but it actually doesn't take that long. It's actually pretty like it's usually removed within a day from what I can tell. So, which is good news. Like I said, this is only one data broker of several that are out there right now. But luckily, there's a lot of options for removal, including manually opting out, but also being able to use a service like Delete Me or Mozilla Monitor. All right. Any questions before we move on? Okay. Feel free to add questions as throughout the presentation in chat. I'm just going to go ahead and jump back into this presentation to go through protecting data on your devices. So if you ever spent some time looking at the Press Freedom Tracker website. Sorry, I thought Zoom broke for a little while, and it's not. It's good. Uh, you'll notice that there's a whole category about device destruction, device seizure. And unfortunately, when it comes to elections, this is becoming more of a thing. And my hunch is that we're going to see more stories of people getting things like cameras, laptops stolen or seized as part of like other sort of like broader conspiratorial sort of like thinking that's making people think that there's, I don't know, like aluminum audio files or something on them. So uh, there's ways to protect yourself from this kind of attack. Of course, this doesn't just happen to elected officials, but also to journalists at the local level, even unrelated to election reporting as well. This happened to a newsroom in Kansas, for example, where police basically raided their newsroom in, I think, Marin to basically go through what they have on their computers. There are ways to protect against this kind of situation. And that is what's with what is called full disk encryption. So we talked a little bit about protecting your data as it exists on the internet, but as far as like your data on your device is like kind of a massive treasure trove if you think about it. Almost every photo that we've taken, conversation that we've had on multiple platforms of all kinds, exists on these kind of devices. And when it comes to protections available to them, we're in luck. We have a lot of options available, which is great. So full disk encryption is one of those, and it comes by different names in a lot of different platforms. Uh, if you're on a Mac, for example, you have a feature in your settings called File Vault, and if you turn that on, it makes it so that in case if there is a Marin style raid on your newsroom, or in case if there is sort of like insurrectionists taking your devices, your laptop, in this case, your Mac, you have a way to protect the data on that Mac so it's not accessible to that person. Because in many cases, like a lot, if you don't have this feature turned on, if you don't have a screen unlock code, if you don't have like a password on your laptop at all, um, you basically run into the risk of people being able to look at that data. But even with just a simple password for your computer or phone, you may also be at risk to things like advanced forensics tools that police have access to and others. On Windows, it's a little bit different. And in this case, File Vault protects against that. So that's great news. On Windows, the story is a little bit different. We have something called BitLocker, which has many features in it, one of which is full disk encryption. The problem is that it's only available in Windows Pro, Windows Enterprise, Windows Education. It's not available in Windows Home, which is what most PCs come with. But if you upgrade to Windows Pro, you have the ability to have this feature and have BitLocker full disk encrypt your hard drive. Android phones really vary. Newer Android phones have a thing that lets you basically encrypt your phone. The thing is, like, Android changes what they call things, like in every release, and every vendor calls it something, and then they change it on every release. So if you look for phone encryption, if you look for file-based encryption, if you look for full disk encryption, if you look for encrypt drive, you can just type in encryption in your settings and see what comes up. And if you find something that kind of sounds like it, that's probably what it is, and you can turn that on. On newer Android Pixel phones, this is turned on by default, which is great news. Also, great news is that if you're on an iPhone, you already have this turned on. So that's great. All right, so very quickly, because I do want to make some time for questions, one of the things that I want to talk about with phishing is uh, this is one of the most common avenues for getting into people's stuff. And when it comes to journalists, were also a target in this regard. So just to go through a few examples, there's like I think Amnesty National. And, phishing has many sort of like reasons or many kind of goals for the attacker. Some of them may be trying to like scam you. And like the kind of scammy, fishy emails, there's not really a technology solution for that because that's kind of just social engineering. But many of them will try to fish you into basically tricking you into giving you your passwords to things so that they can log in as you in a different account. And we're seeing more sophisticated attacks kind of come in a few different places. This report from Amnesty International, which is one example, which I'll link out to here, is kind of a pretty great sort of overview of some of the more advanced phishing attacks that I kind of want to put people on their radar. So this was an attack that is attributed to a group within Iran, and in this case was trying to hijack the online accounts for a number of human rights activists in the Middle East, North Africa region. And many of them targeted sort of tools and platforms that are popular for that crowd because they were told it's like more secure. And they might have some interesting security features, but in this case, they're only protected by a username and password and maybe a 2FA code. So some of these can get very sophisticated. For example, this one, normally when you see a phishing attack, you see a totally different domain name. You might see like, something that kind of looks like the website, but you might notice it maybe is a little bit glitchier, not as like full featured. But then the actual address at the top, the domain name might be just slightly different. And this one is a particularly insidious example because you have things like uh, domain names that maybe sound like the ones that could be the right one and have the full name of the company in it, but use a different top level domain. So for example, tutanota.com is a real email service. Tutanota.de is also a domain name that they have. Tutanota did not buy tutanota.org, so this adversary was able to just basically buy that tutanota.org domain, create an exact replica of that login page, and then trick people into logging in there because they're used to seeing .org in a lot of the websites that they use in the human rights space, so they had kind of a trust associated with it. The same thing here with Proton. This is kind of an older version of their login page and splash page. But in this case, you have just a tiny, tiny, tiny little sort of like change in the domain name. And I don't know if any of you can spot it. The text is really tiny, but there's an E between Proton and mail because Proton email is plausible. And it's like really hard to like tell what the difference is in this case. This is like one of the more advanced kind of phishing attacks that we see happening. And you see this kind of domain name squatting happen all the time, where you have a domain name that looks very similar to the original one, but is actually a totally different one. Um, in some cases, for example, we've seen people create malicious Google sites. So sites.google.com will let you create a website. And in some cases people have used that to try to create sort of like phishing login pages, and people will see the domain name and be like, oh, it's a Google site. It's part of Google, and it's not something that Google owns or controls. It was just a third party that created this using Google sites. And it's a very convincing, some of these are very convincing. Like you can see right away, like this looks exactly what, in 2018, the Proton Mail sort of login looked like. But then you see the domain name is actually off in this regard. And then of course there's kind of more sort of like fake security alerts. They'll look at, a lot of these adversaries will sort of like create an email that looks a lot like a legitimate security alert, and then basically in that blue button, basically hide the link to be like, oh, this actually isn't going to go to Google. This is going to go, or whatever it's trying to target, it's going to go to something else. So it's important to look into what the domains are, especially. But also, per the thing that I mentioned earlier, if you were to enable security key-based authentication with this, like with something like a Yubico security key, this attack basically becomes obsolete because the security key would check to see whether the domain name and whether the TLS certificate behind the scenes actually matches, well, what's going on. All right, so a few questions in chat and comments. iPhone encrypting iOS to iOS, but not SMS. Yes. So this is a good thing to bring up for anybody interested in messaging security. If you're on iOS, which many journalists in the kind of like what I call the Excel corridor of like Boston, New York, Baltimore, DC, Philadelphia are on Apple products. That's great news because we're all talking to each other with end-to-end encryption based on our iMessage messages. But then when we talk to our Android friends, of course, that turns into plain old text message, which is not ideal because text messages don't have any encryption associated with them. And also advanced data protection, really useful for if you want to encrypt things in iCloud in a way that is a little bit more subpoena proof. That is something you can do there. So would I recommend Proton? So it's fine. So the thing about Proton as an email service, and yeah, so in this case we have Proton is a suite of tools now. So they have a VPN service, they have an email service. And so whether I recommend one or the other, I would say like, Wirecutter has a great guide on choosing a good VPN. I would say that for most things, a VPN is largely unnecessary and sort of like redundant for most of the things that we actually use on the internet. For an email service, I would say it's probably fine. I would also just remind people though that email inherently works the same way kind of everywhere, where you have basically when you're writing an email, you're sending a message, but behind the scenes, you're really just adding a record to a database that is in the under the ownership of whatever email provider you're using. And then that record database gets copied into a message that gets sent out to your actual recipient. And that's the way modern email generally works. Proton Mail will end-to-end encrypt messages only between two Proton Mail users, or if your colleague is using PGP and you have their public key and stuff like set up ahead of time, then there are ways to do end-to-end encryption with non-Proton Mail users that way, only if you go through that very, very laborious process. But generally speaking, like if you're using Proton Mail with somebody on Gmail, the fact that you're using Proton Mail basically doesn't matter at that point because you're just using regular email. And as far as recommend VPNs, so there's questions about what about VPNs? Do you recommend them? And I would say that it depends on what you're wanting to do with a VPN. So if you're a journalist outside of the US that wants to go into some place that has a lot of sort of network surveillance, you may want to look into a VPN. If you're worried about, account security, if you're worried about, oh, I'm logging into my work email, I'm logging into Airtable, you don't need a VPN, frankly. If your IT department does a very normal job at setting up an email server, and if you're using a large commercial service like Salesforce or Airtable or Gmail, like all these things are encrypted in transit between you and those service providers so that people cannot eavesdrop on what you're up to on those sites. They can only see that you're connecting to Salesforce, Airtable, or Gmail, for example. But the network operator and everything in between cannot actually see what you're up to there. They cannot actually read your email or steal your credit card numbers. And a VPN isn't going to necessarily protect you from those kind of attacks. The ones that I recommend in this case, so if you do need one for other means, or if you're logging into or visiting sites that you basically want a little bit of protection from because maybe you're researching, some really shady forums and things that you don't want to reveal your real home IP address to. There is a list of recommendations that we have at freedom.press/training, and let me find the specific guide link. Oops. Type. No. There we go. Let's go to the VPN guide. So this kind of goes through what the criteria I use to kind of get to this list. And this is basically a very, very long way to get to some recommendations that if you scroll all the way at the bottom, if you just want sort of the answers to the questions. Molvad, basically. Mozilla VPN uses Molvad. So if you want Molvad, but with like Mozilla pricing, you can do that, which is kind of nice. iVPN, Proton, VPN. Surfshark is fine. There's a few kind of privacy icks around some analytics to use for their apps. But again, if you're trusting a VPN with records of your entire internet sort of like activity, then does it really mean that much that you're also trusting them with like the popularity of which buttons and things you push in the app? I don't know. Cool.
All
All
right.
right.
Thank you so much, David. This has been a great hour full of advice and resources about how to keep yourself online. We really appreciate it. This has been so helpful. And thank you for all the participants who've joined us today and all your questions. Again, we'll share a link to the video soon, along with the resources that David offered today, so you can keep mining this conversation for guidance. And please, again, sign up for our daily free newsletter, The Latest, if you don't already subscribe. We just want to thank you all again for being here, and we hope to see you at a National Press Club Journalism Institute again.